like there's a jazz, contemporary, funky musician who's using the same chords as Stravinsky. And that's when I thought, wow, like it sort of removed all the barriers of music.
Hello and welcome to the Keyboard Chronicles, a podcast for keyboard players. I'm your host, David Holloway, and I'm thrilled as always to be here with you. I'm particularly excited to bring you part one of our interview with Mr. David Hirschfelder. I had the pleasure of interviewing David. We worked out more than 20 years ago, back in the good old days when magazines were a thing and you interviewed musicians for magazines. And obviously I was incredibly impressed with David's amazing career back then. Well, he's certainly achieved a lot more since then. So in part one of this interview, we talk about David's early years, his work with the amazing jazz fusion band Pyramid. We talk about David's involvement with the Little River Band, and we start our discussion on David's work with the absolutely stellar John Farnham. And then what you'll find in part two is we'll continue that discussion, talk about David's incredibly successful film composition and scoring career, and lots more in part two. So yeah, I'll let you jump into part one and I'll see you at the start of part two. David, it's an absolute honour and a pleasure to have you on the show, sir. How are you this fine weekday morning?
Very good, David. Good to see you again after all these years.
Yes, look, it has been a while, and I have mentioned in the introduction I had the pleasure of seeing you in the flesh, I said more than 20 years ago, so no, it's wonderful to have you back on, and I mean, so much has happened since then, and we'll get on to that, but I thought we might just initially kick off with what's the last 12 months been like for David Hirschfelder?
A bit quiet work-wise because I became a grandfather. And twice in one year. And so there was 2 trips to America. And during that, one of them we were there for the birth, and it was 2 months, and I was staying in upstate New York. I did collaborate with my son on an advertising jingle, which came in while I was there. I do those occasionally. Yeah. Because they're fun, and it's great to work with my son, who's also a composer. And what else happened that year? Oh, I recorded a live concert with Mindy Meng Wang, who's she's an amazing musician. She plays guzheng, which is the ancient Chinese harp. She's a phenomenal musician, and we did an improvised concert sort of late 2024 and released an album in early 2025, and we were performing live on just piano and guzheng, improvising to poetry of Dalai Lama, the 6th Dalai Lama, and it was in Mandarin and English, and also mixed with visual art by Ben Thompson, who's a great digital artist. And so, yeah, we did that concert, and then we released an album about a year ago, actually in January, late January 2025. And so we did a little bit of promotion for that. And then also, what else? Oh, I reconnected with a bass player from Pyramid, Roger McLaughlin, who came to our concert. And when we rekindle our friendship, sadly he contracted a terminal illness. And so, yeah, not wishing to bring a downer on the thing, but he passed away, which is sad. So one of the projects I've got going now is to re-release early Pyramid recordings. That was a jazz fusion band I was in the very early 80s. And we're going to re-release some and also release some previously unreleased material, although I think some of it's been on YouTube, but we're going to make a CD release of that. And what else? Oh, I scored a picture with my son, who's he's my co-composing colleague. Whenever I get too busy, we had to write 80 minutes of music in 4 weeks for a documentary about John Clarke. I don't know if you remember John Clarke.
Yes,
the iconic New Zealand Aussie, or Aussie New Zealander, who is a beloved. He made many great appearances on the ABC, and his daughter lovingly curated about 2,000 hours of his footage down to a condensed biopic, or not a biopic, a biography of her father. And so that was a lovely project to work on again in 2025 as well.
Absolutely. And that's the one that screened recently, because I literally watched that only in the last 2 or 3 weeks. So I think they screened it again on the ABC, and it was amazing.
They did, yeah. It had a really good cinema run, very successful, which is great because documentaries often don't go to cinema; they go straight to TV. But this one had a good cinema run, and I mean, it was universally acclaimed. I mean, he's brilliant, and it was just a lot of music to churn through. And but it was a labour of love and a great joy to not only work on that film, telling his story and being a part of his iconic journey, but also working with my son in who's based in LA, and we have similar setups, and we're very compatible. So yeah,
amazing.
It was a pretty full year.
Yeah, absolutely. For a quiet year. So you've alluded to a few things we're definitely going to delve into there. but I thought we'll go back right to the start, just a decade or two ago, David, your childhood and teenage years. So what got you initially into music? What was your sort of musical upbringing?
Well, I discovered piano at the age of 4 at my grandma's house, and my grandma said to my parents, David really loves the piano. I'm going to give it to you because he's played it more than anyone else has in the last 6 months in the last weekend. And so that's how I've developed my love affair with piano and later keyboards. I was classically trained, and but in my early teens, I did discover rock and roll, and I think the first thing that blew my mind was Brian Cadd's incredible piano playing on The Real Thing. He played piano on Russell Morris's The Real Thing, and I listened to that and I thought, wow, I mean, that gave me as much chills as listening to Beethoven, but it had an incredible beat, and so I went to the piano and played it by ear, and that's when I thought, I've got to look more into this modern music. So I sort of straddled both camps for a while. I was still playing and loving classical music, as I still do. I don't play it anymore, but I was very much into rock and roll, and my father bought me an organ, and first thing I did is do what you're not supposed to do and put it through an amplifier and distortion. And I discovered there's a whole world with electronics, and then later I sold my clarinet to buy my first synthesizer, which is a Roland SH5. So that's in a nutshell up till about the age of 18. And then I could keep going, but.
and so that's great. At age 18, so what did you do formal training post 18, or you essentially moved straight into the industry with the training you'd already had?
Well, I am self-taught as a composer and as a keyboardist. When I say keyboardist, I was a classically trained piano player and also learned classical harmony at sort of high school, advanced high school level. I don't know what the education system's like now. I did get into Melbourne University, the Faculty of Music, but in the first year I was getting a lot of recording sessions. And gigs around town, to the extent that I ended up deciding to defer my course at the end of the first year to pursue a live performance career. And, sadly, in a way, I never went back to uni. But at the time, I've got to be honest, there was no real, formal training available in the late 70s for, rock, contemporary music and film scoring, which I was always interested in film scoring, actually. From a very early age, I used to love the big swords and sandals epic films, and I loved the music. I just thought the music made the films, and I remember thinking when I was 6 years old, that's what I want to do when I grow up. I want to make music like that.
Yeah. Great. And tell us about that lead up sort of from around age 18 to actually joining Pyramid. So what was the momentum that got you started in that project?
Well, we'd have a lot of jam sessions with Melbourne younger musicians who are at musicians like Willie Ziegler, who's Deborah Conway's partner and musical director. He used to come along and I just was opened up to a whole world of improvising under the tutelage of Tony Gould, who was my favourite aspect of learning music at Melbourne Uni. He took a jazz orchestra every Wednesday, and that was my favourite. I went to that, and I met Jeremy Allsop on bass and Des McKenna on drums, and a bunch of jazz musicians who eventually led me to David Jones, who's a phenomenal musician, a master percussionist, and he's the same age as me. We had similar interests, and we ended up forming Pyramid. After a couple of years, we settled on Roger McLaughlin on bass and Bobby Vinnier on flugelhorn, who's just an amazing spiritual guru / musician. He really opened my mind to a lot of sort of metaphysical ideas, both musical and non-musical. He was a very deep guy. And so he was a great mentor to have when I was a young musician starting out.
Absolutely. And I mean, was this given your training, and you obviously had a little bit of experience there, was this still a big step up for you? So just for the sake of our viewers and listeners, we'll be linking to some of the video footage. And as you mentioned, David, I was literally watching Roger McLaughlin's YouTube channel last night with some of the amazing stuff from Montreux, and we'll talk about that in a sec. But was this a step up for you being in an outfit of that level of accomplishment, as far as, I assume there was lots of practice involved, but yeah, tell us a little bit about working that act up to being at Montreux in 83.
Well, I did. When my first year of deferring from university, I rented an apartment and hired a grand piano. And practiced like 3 or 4 hours every day. And I also did a lot of transcription of Herbie Hancock solos, George Benson solos, Michael Brecker, a lot of, if I heard a solo on a recording that I liked, an improvisation, I just had to transcribe it and see what the hell they were playing and why I liked it so much. And I think the one that blew my mind the most was Herbie Hancock's solo on actual proof. Just the chords he used, they were polytonal, which I'd discovered earlier when I listened to Stravinsky, and I thought, wow, like there's a jazz contemporary funky musician who's using the same chords as Stravinsky. And that's when I thought, wow, like it sort of removed all the barriers of music. And I went on my own journey of just studying what I liked. Like if I heard a classical piece, I could buy the score and listen to it and analyze it. In the case of jazz musicians, I transcribed them. And so I sort of developed my own set of knowledge. And by the time I was 21, I stopped doing that and was just full-time playing. I was playing 2 or 3 nights a week in a cover band, playing Donny Hathaway and George Benson and more sort of smooth listening music, which is very cool. And then on 2 or 3 nights a week, I was playing more adventurous, avant-garde, improvised and also composed music with the band Pyramid.
Yeah, so you certainly had the chops built up there. As I said, we will link to the Montreux stuff. I mean, what's your recollection of that? I mean, watching some of those videos, again, incredibly tight, incredibly interesting music. What sort of, yeah, was that one of your first big international gigs?
Yeah, when we got the invitation to play the Montreux Jazz Festival, and we had a manager at the time, Liz Holtham, who was she was a huge fan of the band, but very smart woman too, and somehow got a connection with some of the Montreux Jazz Festivals, sent them some recordings of us playing live, and also a recording we'd done in the studio. And they listened to it and they said, yes, we'd like you to come and play at the Montreux Jazz Festival. So that was a big build-up, and that was also the year I got married to my beloved. It was a huge lady, beautiful lady I'm still with after 43 years. So it was a huge time, and first big trip overseas, and to be performing there was amazing. Was just an amazing experience. We played one night, and then we were on very late because it went way over schedule. And Claude Nobbs came out and said, "Look, I'm going to announce a special surprise. I'm inviting Pyramid to perform again tomorrow night." And we opened for Lonnie Liston Smith on his show. We did a 1 hour set. So what you see on YouTube is a combination of that performance and also the night before.
Wow.
So.
And look, we are a keyboard playing podcast, Dave, so I've got to ask you, in those videos, your rig looks incredible.
Thank you.
It's a huge rig, and I think we're going to be talking about rigs at different junctures of your career. But just tell us about what you were packing then. I think I saw was there a Rhodes there? You had a Mini Moog, maybe. What was sort of your rig, if you can recall back then?
I sure can. I had a Rhodes, and I think it was. Did I have a 73 or an 88? I've had both. I think at that stage I was packing a 73. And we'll go sort of the first level, which is the pianos. There was a Rhodes, there was a CP70, which I opted for that. I upgraded later that year to a CP80, but that stage was a CP70. On top of the CP70, I had a Korg Poly 6. Which I used mainly it had a great arpeggiator in it, and it was a really great instrument, to just, quickly call up a diversity of sounds. It had some very cool, unusual filtering, inverse polarity stuff, which the Prophet 5, which was the other synth I had, did not have. So I had a Prophet 5 as well, which was hooked up to a sequencer. I don't know if you remember the old sequencers they used to go hand in hand. This was pre-MIDI, by the way.
Yeah.
Later, later in the year when I joined as a river band, I put MIDI on every keyboard I could. Under the Prophet 5, I had a really interesting keyboard, which was kind of a Korg electric piano, but you could sort of add strings to it. That's what I liked it. And it could sound harpsichord-like and clavinet. I replaced the clavinet, which I used to have. Sometimes I regretted that decision because the clavinet's such an awesome instrument. But this instrument could do the clavinet parts, but it was more harpsichord-like, but it was kind of interesting and quirky. And then you could sort of add strings to it instantly, so you could get a wash of sounds very quickly live. I think that's all I had. Oh, and I did have a drum machine as well.
Wow.
I had a Korg drum machine that was all hooked up via the very ancient ASCII connection, which was sort of like a clock thing. I don't know how it all worked, and I can't remember the exact detail, but it was...
that's amazing. Yeah, particularly pre-MIDI with drum machines, that's no easy feat. I know I think you were doing a lot of the covering of the bass lines with your left hand too, while soloing with the right. So, I mean, obviously that your upbringing led to that, but I mean, that hand independence, was that something you had to progress a lot further when you were with Pyramid, or you pretty much had that down by that stage?
Look, I had it down. I worked a lot on my left hand when I was woodshedding. I call it the woodshedding year, which was 1977, when I was working at a nightclub, 6 nights a week, getting good money, and then I'd have all day to practice. I mean, I'd sleep in till about 10 or 11, and then I'd practice all afternoon. Because, I mean, the nightclub era, this is back when nightclubs actually had live music.
Yes.
And then before DJs came along. Still great love for DJs, no disrespect, but at that time there was a transition, and we would do, but anyway, in my 6 months tenure at this nightclub, that was when I did probably the most practice in my life. And then I lost my license, which was a miracle. And I had to go back to Ballarat, where I grew up. And then I practiced even more. And I got a job in a local Ballarat nightclub 4 nights a week, which again kept me sustained. And then when I got my license back, I would drive back and forth, and I was just so busy. So yeah, I bought a combi van so I could cart all my gear around. I was just saying to a friend of mine the other day, gosh, I must have had a lot of energy and strength when I was in my 20s, because I lived in an apartment in 1980 and it was upstairs. And after a gig at 2 a.m., I'd have to carry the CP70 and the Rhodes and all my synths. At that stage, I think I had an ARP Quadra, which was not light. It was a nice big synth.
Wow.
That was before I got the Poly 6, which was a lot smaller. But the ARP Quadra is a cool instrument. Yeah, but I had a lot of gear, and it was all heavy. Keyboards were much heavier. So you young guys and girls who playing keys now, no offense, but you got it much easier from a weight point of view.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a major feat of strength doing that. And just one last question about Pyramid. Were there key influences on you as a band? Because watching some of the music, and obviously jazz fusion's incredibly diverse and whatever, one of the ones that screamed out to me was Gentle Giant, but there were others, like just were there particular influences on you when you're in that band?
Look, yes, there were. The short answer is yes, there are huge influences. In fact, the first, probably the biggest influence was Joe Zawinul's Weather Report. Joe Zawinul's approach to keyboards. I actually watched him perform live in Melbourne in '79, and I never got an Oberheim synthesizer or an ARP 2600, which were his keys, but I managed to get similar sounds. And then develop my own sounds. But I was very much influenced by his approach to synthesis. He sort of used an orchestral approach, which I guess called me in later into discovering my desire to be an orchestral or reconnect with my childhood dream to write music for large, acoustic ensembles. And, but he was a magician, and I saw him as a wizard who was able to conjure up the feeling of an orchestra with, some very cool analog synths. And, he had the Oberheim 4-voice and so I sort of, and his approach to the Rhodes, like specifically the way he used the Neutron biphaser, which I had. I actually went and bought one as soon as I found out that's what he used. I bought a Neutron biphase, which sadly I didn't keep, but, I loved what you could do with it, the stereo, making the synced stereo oscillators. So I had two speakers, one either side of the stage, and the Rhodes was just this giant pad, jumping from one speaker to the other, not with the tremolo that the Rhodes is famous for, but for the stereo kind of wobble courtesy of the Neutron biphase. So yeah, he was a big influence, and also Herbie Hancock, his approach to keys. And picked particular the way he approached voicings on the CP 70 and 80 inspired me to, that was a huge influence on me as well. Yeah. So those two were probably the biggest influence. And Chick Corea,
of course.
All the Miles Davis recordings, like Bitches Brew, what an incredible, all that stuff seeped into my subconscious and came out as my own version of that music.
Nah. Absolutely. And I'm so thrilled to hear that some of it's been, you mentioned that you're sort of curating and some releasing of some of the materials. I can't wait to hear that. What was the sort of, the segue from Pyramid and LRB? You've mentioned that. So, and obviously there'd be very few people around the world that listen to this, and the majority of our listeners are in the UK and US. They will have also heard of Little River Band. Just tell us a little bit about the impetus for moving into that sphere.
Well, Little River Band was an accidental move on my part. Not accidental, but it was pure random luck. In fact, most of the things that happened to me were sort of random. Luckily, I was up to the task when the plate was handed to me. But unbeknownst to me, there was two members of the Little River Band which were huge jazz fusion fans, and they would secretly sneak into Pyramid gigs. And so they recommended me to Graham Goebel, the main songwriter, who was keen on the idea of having spicing up their sound a little bit and going a little bit more, steering the direction a little bit more into an area of sophistication or whatever, I don't know. But he called me out of the blue, and I sort of I recognized the name Graham Goebel. He said, Graham Goebel, and then there was a pause. I'm from the Little River Band. I thought, oh, wow. Okay. And he said, look, he invited me to play on a record. They were actually they were recording it, and they wanted a session player to come and play keys, as they often did on their recordings. Previously, they had the great Peter Jones, who is another mentor of mine, fantastic musician. Melbourne based. And so they wanted to give me a crack, and so I played on their record, and then did a tour with them late in 83. And then during that tour, they asked me to become a full-time member. And I thought, well, this is great. And I mean, honestly, at the time, it wasn't the sort of music I was really chasing, but what I did learn and admire in their work ethic was an intention to detail. They had so much, like the professionalism was just on a whole other level to what I'd ever experienced with a massive crew. And I didn't have to worry about lugging keyboards anymore, because there was someone to not only cart them in for me, but to set them all up, and do you like it this way, and how do you want it, and then make suggestions. You know, if you set them up this way, we can do this, and suddenly it was like, oh wow, it was hard to go back after that experience, after being spoiled with a professional crew, technicians, and yeah, it was. And look, they are fantastic musicians. They are really. I learned a lot from them. I learned a lot about stagecraft. John Farnham was their lead singer at the time. So I also learned a lot about how to communicate with an audience and what presses audiences' buttons. And I think that informed me a lot about the storytelling in music, which I knew innately, but just to be involved in music on that level and to see how the songs connect with the crowd and how the performers connect with the audience, it was a great eye-opener for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I've heard of that Farnham guy. We might talk about him later if we get time. But it's so you went on to record 3 albums with LRB, and you co-wrote a number of the songs, which are amazing. So what were your recollections of both those early recording processes, particularly as a co-writer, and those early gigs? Again, I mean, you'd already been at a high level with Pyramid, but were there particular things? You've already talked about stagecraft, but anything else that you recall?
Well, I also, I guess, having a regular income, which was a new thing for a freelance musician, being part of a band which was more solvent financially and, enabled me to take more risks and invest more money in equipment. I bought a Fairlight during that time. And in fact, I bought that just prior to the Playing to Win album, LRB Playing to Win album. And so I delved as deeply as I could into that. Not as deep as you can. That was a very deep instrument. But I basically used the sequencer part of it rather than there's a section where it's like code. You write code into the computer and it generates things. I didn't go that deeply, I'll be honest, but I could relate to page R, which was a fantastic sequencer page, and the light pen, and you could sort of pop notes in using the light pen, which was, we're talking before the days of computer mice. And I sort of, and then also you could, finesse your waveforms with Fourier analysis. I did get into that, and and I did merge sounds. Like one of my favorite noises I got on the Playing to Win sequence was a combination of woodblock and clavinet. And by merging those two waveforms together, which was slightly different to sort of doubling them, it was sort of like you could really mix and sort of then mess with the sound a little bit. It created a very interesting tone. That was a big eye-opener for me, that instrument, and then using that in a pop sense. And of course, even though it was a pop band, they gave me license to be quite, within the harmonic framework of their songs. They gave me a lot of encouragement to be, quite experimental with the sound of what I did. Yeah. So within that genre. So I enjoyed a lot of the discipline and the creativity involved in that.
Yeah, and I've got to ask about the Fairlight, David. back at the time when you bought that, I'm guessing, and for, I think our listeners and viewers will be aware that the Fairlight was an Australian-initiated instrument, so it was created in Australia. How many people do you think in Australia though owned them? Because they were pricey. Like
Yeah. It was. When I bought it back then, it was $35,000 back in 1984, which was, if I think I did the math once, and it's like the equivalent of paying $150,000 now for one instrument. And, I'm lucky I have a very supportive partner who we'd saved up money for a deposit for a house. And she, look, it worked out well in the end, but she took the leap of faith with me. She said, I said, look, I really like this instrument. I don't see how we can afford it. And she said, you know what? I have a feeling it's going to be a good idea.
Yeah.
And so, there she was, the earth mother of intuition, sort of could tell that it was going to somehow pay us back at some point, which it did, LRB, and then I went on to use it with Whispering Jack, John Farnham's record. And, so it really did earn its keep. And, but sadly, funnily enough, I didn't buy it outright. I bought it on lease. So at the end of the period, I owed $14,000 on it. And, I only had 12, and I could only sell it for 12,000.
Yeah.
So I had to let it go. But I'll tell you why I let it go, because by the time the lease was up, I'd already replaced it touring with an Akai sampler, which I sort of transferred all the samples over that I needed and thought it was time to let it go. And I sometimes regret that, because there's definitely something special about that. But as everyone knows, that was the start of an incredible explosion in keyboard technology. So,
it'd be interesting in an Australian context how many of you had them. I can think of two. I know Ivor Davies had one, and I know you had one, and there might have been lucky to have been a handful of others, I'm guessing. But amazing instrument. And so the other thing I do have to talk while we're still in LRB land, you've mentioned Playing to Win. It's an iconic song. Ironically, I'm literally spending the next week learning that song for my Weekend Warrior cover band. And it's not easy. I'm sure it is to you, but it's certainly not to me. Just tell us you've already mentioned about the sound, which is fascinating, how you combined the sounds. But just tell us about the recording process on that track and the amazing playing in that and what you used.
As I said, the Fairlight was one component, and probably the main component of it. But I also had some brass stabs. So the Fairlight is an 8-voice. There are 8 monophonic voices. So in a way, if you want chords, and that was the core of the sequencer. And but I was also doubling it with Prophet 5 for some brass stabs, and then there was also a monophonic glock at the top, which I just mixed in a little bit. I don't know. It's hard to sing the part, but when it goes do 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 ba 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 da do do do, so the low notes were just very low. And the good thing about the Fairlight is it was sort of 8-bit and grungy, so it sounded interesting. So when you played the notes low, they were just a robotically low version of the samples that was up there, but it sounded interesting. Yes. And it was a matter of capitalizing. You're not trying to mimic acoustics instruments or acoustical properties at all. You're using something that started out as acoustic and it's been messed up by 8-bit. Yeah, it's hard to describe, but I had a lot going on. In fact, Spencer Proffer, the producer, he would come in while I was working on it. I had my keyboard rig set up, and he'd just look and say, "I have no idea what you're doing in here, but just utilize my engineers and staff and they'll bring you whatever you need, and they'll help you record it." And then, so I recorded all this stuff first, and then the band overdubbed to the Fairlight on that track. Actually,
wow.
So anyway.
Yeah, incredible song. And I think most people listening or watching this are absolutely aware of it. So no, thank you. And I can assure you I'm doing a dumbed down version of your playing for my band. It's just an amazing song. And so obviously LRB, I said you did 3 albums, did a lot of live performance with them as well. Now there's an obvious link there as far as the move into John Farnham's band, but what was sort of the broader impetus for that occurring as well?
Well, John Farnham. Okay, so here's a little bit of a slightly sad story. Little River Band was a fantastic musical experience, but in the end, it struggled to connect with its audience in America with another lead singer other than Glenn Shorrock, and so we were all a bit disheartened because we and the band, Graham and Wayne, the remaining, and Steve Housden, they just felt it was the best version of the band that they'd had. But that doesn't always translate to, and it's nothing to do with the new personnel. It's just the fact that the band's changed and taken a bit of a, in some ways we sounded sometimes more like Yes than we did Little River Band. It was quite a high-tech progressive sound, which didn't, I guess, sit comfortably with a lot of LRB fans, which is fair enough. It's just what it is. It's not a complaint, or it's just an observation. And so in the end, we decided, we gave it one more go. We did an album called Now Rains, but that just didn't connect with anyone at all. And I think we decided shortly after we'd finished recording that album to go our separate ways. And John said to me in the car on the way home from that meeting, he said, "Look, I want to do a solo album. I've got ideas. I really want to make the music I want to make. I'm 37 years old, and this is my last chance. I really want to reinvent myself. Are you up for being part of that?" And I said, "Mate, I'd love to. I mean, I just love the guy, and he's an incredible singer, and I really thought that would be a lot of fun," and it was. And so I set up my entire rig in his studio, in his basement of the house. And he was renting the house at the time because, with the LRB ended up being in financial strife, and we didn't really, it was a financial strain on all of us. And I was renting and he was renting at the time. And so, I just set up in there and we mucked around for 2 or 3 months and ended up making Whispering Jack, the bones of it. And of course, once I'd sequenced it all up, I had, I had a QX1 sequencer. I had the Fairlight. Ross, the producer, brought along an SP12 drum machine, which we hooked up to that, and he'd sampled a whole lot of interesting pseudo drum sounds like slamming porch doors and things like that. Not that any of us had a Porsche at the time, but I think it was Glenn Wheatley's Porsche, actually. Yeah. So we sort of made we made this record up and had no idea that it was going to be as big as it was.
Yeah. And look, so I'm going to set this up for our viewers and listeners that aren't aware, although there won't be many of them. So in an Australian context, there's no doubt John Farnham and the band at the time too were absolutely revered. Yeah, I'm talking for our US listeners, I'm talking Springsteen level. For UK, there are a whole range of artists I would equate to as well. But in an international context, obviously John Farnham is revered as a singer. He's considered a singer's singer, and there's a long list of international singers that cite him as either as an influence or as an amazing inspiration. So that's just a long-winded way of saying this was an amazing period, David. And you said mucking around in the basement, coming up with Whispering Jack. So, I mean, the liner notes famously credit Jack as playing keyboards, drums. You've already talked about the Fairlight CMI, so that was obviously a key part. I think you've already mentioned you use Page R to do a lot of that, but just tell us about the programming side and how you set up a lot of that.
Well, I had Page R. At that stage, that the Fairlight was MIDI retrofitted. So, in fact, I had 2 QX1 sequences, one to drive the Fairlight because we just felt that it was easier to have. I came up with the ideas, Page R, but in the end, I transferred the parts to QX1 for live. But so when we made the record, we had one QX1 which was hooked up to a bank of 8 DX7s, the TX816. I fell in love with the DX7 in the while I was with Little River Band in 1984. No, yeah, 1980, late 83. I bought a DX7. And I actually used it not only for its signature bell sounds and the FM sounds you normally associate with that, but also it had some amazing string textures, which were really complex, which I used on Whispering Jack. It also had some incredible synth warbly effects, which you don't normally think of. You normally think of those as a warmer analog synth sound. And I was able to experiment and get a lot of really useful sounds out of the DX7. I loved it so much I ended up buying a rack of 8 of them and hooking it up to the sequencer so that I could have multi-layers of DX7s, which is really, that's the sound of Whispering Jack. It's all DX7s and Fairlight and a Prophet 5 for some added punch here and there and some analog warmth, and the drum machine, the SP12. So that we had them all hooked up, MIDI clock. So once you started it, you sort of, you could stop and it knew where it was up to. To the bar. They were all sort of locked to a bar position. So if you started at, say, bar 35, everyone would jump to that somehow. Is that how it worked? Or did I have to?
Could have been.
I don't know how I have a feeling we had to sort of, it's really stretching my memory now because, of course, later in the early 90s, by then, I was using SMPTE code where everything just locked.
That's right.
To a timeline. But this was prior to that. This was when I, using it and I was just making this up as I went. Yeah. I was just reading the manuals and saying, how the hell does this work? And so somehow we got it all to work. And then we overdubbed to the sequences that were generated. We overdubbed I played a lot of additional keyboard parts in the studio, gave it another layer. And then we added a lot of guitars as well. And John, we discovered this young player, Brett Garsett, who's a phenomenal player. So he played guitar. Roger McLaughlin, my colleague from Pyramid, he played fretless bass.
Wow.
So there was a few overdubs, but essentially, it was a techno-driven, it was an amalgam of a contemporary sort of post-industrial techno pop sound. When I say techno, not high-tech pop, with a sort of an orchestral overview, I guess, drawing in from my Joe Zawinul training in the early 80s. And we were just having fun making the music that we liked making, choosing the best songs that were thrown at us, writing a couple of songs ourselves to make it up to a 10-track album.
Which is amazing. No, that's not too much at all. And so I know you have a co-writing credit with Going, Gone on that album as well. So I'm struggling to recall the sequence, but at that stage when you were recording, did you have a record company on board or you actually pitched the album to a record company? I can't remember the sequence of this.
Well, how that record came out was really amazing. John, at this stage, was considered a sort of a washed-up singer. Sadly. And, that's unfortunately it's a harsh industry and you can easily fall into the wrong category. So the only person who believed in him really was his manager, Glenn Wheatley, who's also a good friend. And he always believed in John's talent and just had a strong feeling that this has to work. You can't have a singer that good, and an album this good, it's worth taking a huge punt on, which he did. Glenn Wheatley actually put a lot of money into this, and funded. It cost over $100,000 to record in the studio, which was a big gamble on his part. And then he had to probably pay that again on promotion. And he formed his own record company.
Yes.
I think he might have already just formed it, and it was licensed through BMG, but he was the label. So he took all the financial risk, and BMG agreed to distribute it.
That's right.
So it was Wheatley Records distributed through BMG.
Just amazing. Yeah. And just a couple more questions on the recording of that album, if you don't mind, David. So
Sure.
obviously, it doesn't get any bigger as far as a song than You're the Voice and the bagpipe solo. So did you sample a real piper? I can't actually recall the story around this either, or you were using the Fairlight. How did you sort of approach that in the recording?
Well, in the recording, we were actually in the studio, and we'd tracked all the keys that were pre-produced in the garage. And then John wasn't satisfied, and I'd sort of used these samples and mixed with synths of panpipes and flutes, no bagpipes. And it didn't change key. It didn't change from the F to the B flat, which it had to. So John said, I think it really needs bagpipes. And we thought, what the hell? Okay. We gave it a go. I went to the bagpipe. We found the best bagpipe expert in Melbourne. I went to his house, and he said, well, for a start, bagpipes only play in B flat.
Yeah.
So you're going to have to either vari-speed the tape, which will make the bagpipe sound weird, or you'll have to change the key. So I had to go back and redo just that section, which was the solo, which was had to move that from F up to B flat. But ironically, moving it to B flat was already preparing it for the bridge to the chorus, we're all someone's daughters, we're all someone's sons. That's in B flat. So having the chorus, having the solo, if you like, the instrumental in B flat was a nice lift from the end of the chorus to the instrumental, and it set it up beautifully. And it actually made the song sound better, that so-called limitation of the bagpipes.
Yeah.
So, it was. So we recorded 4 bagpipe players 4 times. So we had the sound of 16 real bagpipes. And then to do that live, actually a friend of mine, Steve Lincoln Smith from Yamaha, it turned out he's a bagpipe player. And so he allowed me to sample his bagpipe notes individually so I could play them live on a sampler.
Amazing. That's amazing.
By then, I'd learned all the little ornaments and everything that bagpipes play, because they play all these little tiny notes in between the notes. They've got Gaelic terms, but they're sort of ornaments that enable them to put separation and reattacking of the notes, because a bagpipe is just starts and stops. There's you can't tongue with your tongue or anything. It's all just, you have to attack the note by putting grace notes and ornaments between the notes of your melody. And so I learned I had this crash course in how bagpipes work. So I was able to then reverse engineer that and play it live.
That's amazing. And just as a brief segue, did that ever pay off in your later film scoring career? Have you ever needed to use bagpipes in any of your scores? I'm just trying to recall.
I haven't. I've never used them.
There you go.
And I've wanted to. Actually, I ended up using samples of an Ilian pipe, which is a different sound altogether. But I've used samples of those, but I've never worked with a live. Sadly, and I'm not proud of it, I've never used a live one again. It's such an amazing sound.
I love it. And obviously the album's recorded. I'm going to jump forward a little bit here. You're then out on tour, touring it, and it was an incredible tour. How did you replicate such a densely produced studio album live? So what was your touring rig? I think you've already talked about sort of a bit of the mapping you needed to do, but just how did you approach it? Because that's no mean feat on its own.
Yeah, well, I think it was for the live tour. That was when I did away with the Fairlight was too cumbersome to carry around. And when I realized, when someone said to me, if you get an Akai S1000, you'll be able to have, about 4 Fairlights worth of sounds in there. Or no, in fact, I had we didn't have to change discs.
Wow.
To load up different. The Fairlight had such limited memory, but the Akai S1000 could have everything all sitting there ready to go, just as programs that would be called up. So, and it was, it was just sort of that big, as opposed to a massive mainframe and a screen. So, I needed to drive it with something. Well, there was an 8-note sequencer, the QX1. So I got a second QX1, had the 2 QX1s synced. And so literally a lot of the pre-programmed keyboard parts were happening. So there was literally probably about, half a dozen of me on stage playing from the pre-recorded stuff. So yeah, and I had to develop these, click track scenarios. Instead of using a click track, we actually made percussion parts that sounded like they were part of the band, and it didn't matter if there was a bit of bleed from that, because this was all in the days before in-ear monitors.
Yeah.
So this was the day when no one wore headphones or in-ear monitors. So you just had to have, if you had a bit of spill, you had to make sure it sounded musical enough to blend in with the.
Wow.
So that's how we did that. And that worked quite well. The drummer liked it because he had this specific percussion part to lay in, to work with, without having just a click going,
And so Angus was just working with that coming through the monitors, essentially.
Yeah.
Wow.
And that's what we did with Little River Band too. Steve Presswich, a phenomenal drummer, Cold Chisel's drummer. Can't believe we managed to get him when Derek Polici left. Steve was a beautiful guy, wonderful human being, a rock solid drummer, great R&B drummer, and an amazing songwriter too. He actually ended up writing a couple of songs that LRB recorded. Anyway, he was very happy with that. I developed that technique during Little River Band, so I had it pretty finely honed by the time we toured with John Farnham. That was the way we did it, and so it meant that I could even at sound checks just walk away from the keyboard sometimes or put I had an extension cord on the KX5 guitar, and I could walk out the front and have a listen to what the band sounds like. It was pretty nice.
It was. And look, I do need to ask about the live, and there's a amazing visual record of this, and it's something that I recorded off the TV and played to death on my VCR, which was the Classic Jack release. And obviously that was filmed in Melbourne with the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra. And so I do have to ask you about that.
Sure.
A couple of questions around that was, first was your recollection of the filming? And because that was a big production piece, it came across brilliantly, but I imagine there was a lot of preparation involved in that.
Yeah, there was. And actually, I think a lot of the shots, it was shot I'm pretty sure over 2 nights, but one of the nights I came down with the flu. I was so sick. And so they just doped me up with pseudoephedrine, and I felt amazing. But I was still pretty out of it. I don't know how I got through that, to be honest. I guess when you're in your 20s, you have superhuman powers that you don't have when you're older. But I got through it. And yeah, the camera work, it was all set up. By then, the show was so finely honed. We'd done a lot of shows. And so it was decided we need to make a visual document of this and record it. So they made the special for Channel 7 or whatever, one of the TV shows.
Which is absolutely amazing. And I'm saying this now, we're 2/3 of the way through the interview, so I'm not doing this to be charming to try and convince you to stay, but there are very few exceptions of people that can get away with playing a guitar, and you're definitely one of them. So you were dressed amazing, looked amazing, and killed it on the guitar. So that's number one. Number two, what's fascinated me doing both research for this interview, but just over the last 6 months anyway, I'm not sure you're aware, over the last 2 years, there are at least a dozen reaction videos from different singing teachers in the US, UK, you name it, on a bunch of those songs from that night. So obviously that's about John's voice, but I mean, You're the Voice, Help, and Long Way to the Top. If you look on YouTube, there are at least a dozen reaction videos for every single one of them, where people now to this day are having their minds blown by the performance of the band and obviously John's voice.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen one of those. There's a gentleman with long sort of dark braids, and he's a African-American vocal guru, and he'll look on his face when he first hears John sing a note. He just says, "Oh my God." His eyes just pop out of his head. Who is this guy?
Yeah.
He was discovering him for the first time. And I was so heartwarmed by that, because that was the same feeling I had when I was 19 and I was at a jazz club hearing Kerry Bedell, and she invited John on stage. And Kerry Bedell's a very she's a hardcore jazz singer. Can't imagine why she would invite a pop singer like John up, until he sang Georgia. And when I heard him sing Georgia, the old jazz standard, he absolutely sang the shit out of it. He was incredible. And I thought, oh my God, I never knew he could sing like that. And that's when I discovered that he's absolutely freak of nature.
Yeah,
he
absolutely.
Really